Today, we are going to talk about learnings and observations that I've made not only as a flower farmer over the past 3 years, but as someone who has owned a side small business for close to 10 years, someone who has an undergraduate finance and economics degree, and as someone who spent the first 3.5 years of her first career literally analyzing financial statements to determine whether or not we should invest in companies. Hi, my name is Jessie, and if you're new to my channel, I typically focus my videos on the business side of things. Today, you can think of this video as a crash course into a flower farming MBA within a single video. I have actually been taking notes throughout the entire year through these observations that I've been making either through Facebook group forums, through learnings from myself or stories from other people who have contacted me. And I am ready to share all of that in a single video. I am going to be a little bit more brutally honest and blunt in this video, and I'm going to cover topics that we typically don't hear talked too much about, especially in Western culture. We're going to start right off the bat with stuff in the money bucket, things all related to money observations that I've made, especially mistakes that people make in this category. Then we're going to talk something that I typically talk a little bit more about, marketing and sales. And last but not least, we have the most amount of learnings in the how to build a sustainable long-term business / how to be an entrepreneur type of observation. So without further ado, let's get started. Let's dive right into money, a topic that is often under-discussed on social media and YouTube. And when discussed, it's really high level about making money, but nothing around the other important aspects of it. And the truth is that my observation is most people don't understand how to make money work for them. Take credit cards as an example. Credit cards are often feared by people because those people believe that it's going to get them into debt, when in reality, it can actually be a very powerful tool. The beauty about a credit card is that you can buy something and not pay for it until the next billing cycle. I can't tell you how many times in my flower farming journey, as well as when I started my side hustle soap company, that I did not have the money in my bank to pay for something that I really needed in order to generate revenue. But I knew that if I had that tool, I would be able to generate that revenue before the next billing cycle through something like a farmer's market or something like a CSA. So what I would do is I would buy the item on the credit card, wait to get that money in, and then I would pay it off by the next billing cycle. So if you are confident that you can pay off your credit card by the next billing cycle and not incur any interest, then you have effectively created an interest-free loan, a short-term interest-free loan to buy something and pay for it later. On top of that, most credit cards give you rewards, points. My business credit card that I personally use gives me 2% cash back on every single purchase, which effectively means that every single thing that I buy is 2% off. Certain credit cards also carry things like insurance, maybe travel insurance or insurance for your devices or whatever it is that you buy. And we typically always put our high value items on certain types of credit cards. So someone who is savvy with credit cards is actually going to have multiple different types of credit cards to maximize the benefits and the rewards of those credit cards. In my personal life, we have a credit card that is dedicated for groceries, I have another credit card that is dedicated for gas. We have this all-encompassing credit card that is for all types of purchases. Before COVID, when we did a lot of travel, we had a travel type of credit card. The point is, if you know how to use credit cards, you could be earning hundreds to thousands of dollars back every single year through rewards and points. And you can use credit cards as a powerful tool for cash flow management. And cash flow management is a concept we're going to talk a little bit more about throughout this video because it is one of the most important concepts for someone to be able to understand and do well in order to manage a business. Next, let's talk about debt. So, debt is a touchy topic. Here in America, we have a really profound debt issue. And a lot of times not because of the fault of the person who's taking out the debt, due to a lack of financial literacy, especially with student loans. And now that we've been in this medical journey, I can totally see why people take on crippling medical debt. But let's talk about debt in the form of starting a flower business. My personal approach is I do not want to take on debt for a small business like a flower farm. I am not necessarily opposed to the idea of debt, just opposed to the idea of having debt for a flower farm. And the primary reason is because, one, I don't want the stress of a side hustle giving me to pay off debt. But two, I don't believe that a small business like a flower farm, especially in the capacity that I'm doing it at as a smaller flower farmer, is warranted in terms of taking on debt. Now, if you are someone who is trying to scale really, really quickly, who has a business background or is just very savvy in terms of running a business, then by all means, I think that there are few cases out there of very successful people who have taken on debt and scaled and gotten to a point where it made sense for them to do that. But I'll be honest, the majority of people should not be taking on debt for a flower farm. You typically see a lot of upfront costs in things like a startup because there's a lot of labor, there's a lot of investment, and they're expecting what we call a hockey stick growth to be able to pay back all of the stuff that they invested upfront. Unfortunately, flower farming is not a type of business where you're going to see that hockey stick type of growth. If anything, you're going to see a lot of growth in the beginning, and then you're going to plateau, and then until you get to the next level, then you'll see another bigger piece of growth and so forth. And so what I'm trying to say here is that you want to make sure that you moderate your spending with the amount of money that you're going to generate in, and along the way, then you invest more into the flower farming business to get you to that next level. But if you had to take on debt, what are certain things or certain options that you could have? The first and foremost that everyone should be considering is crowdfunding from friends and family. And crowdfunding these days, there's technology platforms for you to do it. You don't necessarily have to text friends and family to send you like a check or wire you money. There are things like Indiegogo, Kickstarter, and a bunch of other companies that you can do this on. When we launched our soap company, we launched an Indiegogo campaign and we raised about $2,500 to get us started. For my flower farming business, I was able to fund using the money that I made from that side hustle soap company to give me the first $5,000 for my flower farm company. But if I did not have it, I would go to friends and family because they are not expecting you to pay them back with interest. In fact, they are technically donating to you in exchange for a potential reward. So you can give them like a bouquet of flowers, or you can give them like a CSA light type of reward if they've donated a lot to you. But let's say you don't have enough friends and family to raise a certain amount that you need. Another viable option is to look at the current bank website platform that you are working with and see if they offer one of these small business capital solutions. So for example, Shopify actually has a little segment, Shopify Capital, that will lend shops money and have that shop pay back the loan through online sales. So for example, when I was entering into the holiday planning season for my soap company, in like July, I would need to start buying inventory for the holidays, and this would typically cost low five figures. So sometimes I didn't have that low five figure in my bank account. Again, tight cash flow management issues here. So I would take out loans through Shopify Capital. The interest was a little high, around 10%. This is at a time around like before and during COVID when interest rates were relatively low. So a 10% interest rate is not low, but it's also not unbearable. So take out like a $10,000 loan to be able to buy all this inventory for the holidays, and then I would start selling it. And as I sold, every single purchase would pay back a portion of the loan. And of course, the majority of my sales would happen during the holidays. So I would say by the time the first quarter ended of the following year, I would have already paid back that loan. And what I liked about that approach was payback was very manageable because it was only taking a portion of my sales. So what Shopify did here was it looked at my sales history and it looked at just what amount of debt they thought I could take on and pay back to them so that they could assume the least financial risk and also get some money back through interest. And so that's why they wouldn't loan me like $50,000 because they knew that it would take me like 2 years to pay that back. They would loan me up to like $15,000 or $20,000. And I typically chose something like $10,000 or $15,000. I know that the online bank that I use for b.a.r.e. Flower Farm called Novo also offers this. So Unfortunately, if you are just starting out as a new flower farmer, you're not going to be able to reap these types of benefits from, or you're not going to be able to reap the benefits of these services because they need some sort of history from your bank or your shop. But if you are someone who is like at least in year 1 or year 2, you have some sort of established presence on a web platform or on an online banking system, you might want to see if stuff like this is available. And this is also a nod to exploring newer types of banking systems, because your traditional Bank of America or Chase account is probably not going to offer you these types of solutions, but you can always call them to ask. The very, very last route I would ever use for any type of flower farming debt, even if it's for a packet of seeds, is a credit card. You will end up paying what should have been a $5 packet of seeds to $50 because of the atrocious amount of interest that credit cards carry. Unless if you are absolutely confident that you can pay it off in the next billing cycle where you only incur 1 month of interest, even then that's a very slippery slope. I would not recommend using credit cards, and only using credit cards when you are confident that you can pay it off within a certain billing cycle. On the topic of debt, I also want to talk about the different types of debt, especially when it comes to buying something like land. For a lot of new flower farmers, one of the more popular questions I see on Facebook groups is, should I buy this piece of land? And the mentality is, my current house right now, I don't have a lot of land to be able to grow on, so let me go buy a piece of land because it's relatively cheap and it's an asset, so it will appreciate if things don't work out. The faulty assumption here is that land is going to appreciate. And the reality is that land with a structure in the form of a house will appreciate over time, or typically will appreciate over time. Land without a structure has a lot more challenges in terms of appreciation. Now, if that land is in an area of high demand, then yes, it will be likely to appreciate. But if you are in an area where housing prices are really expensive and there's not a ton of land, and you find a really cheap piece of land, it's cheap for a reason. It's cheap likely because it's not buildable upon. Sometimes on these pieces of land, you can't even farm on because there are restrictions like wetlands or whatever. The point is that if you really want to buy land, you absolutely need to be doing your due diligence. And I would go as far to recommend someone who is completely new to flower farming to never buy land, and start off first with renting. Rent a plot of land to see if you even want to flower farm. A lot of people after the first couple of seasons are like, this is not something I actually want to do for money. I just want to stick to gardening, which is a lot more joyful and it gives me a lot less stress than flower farming. Because otherwise you're going to buy this piece of land, you're going to figure out how to get all this irrigation stuff to it, and then you're not going to like it, and you're going to be stuck with this piece of land that you can't get rid of. So we talked a little bit earlier about the importance of this concept called cash flow management. So I want to talk about a very important concept here, which is that the number one reason why most businesses fail is because they run out of cash. Cash being the key word here. So a lot of these companies that I'm referencing to are things like restaurants or even startups. So I mentioned before that startups typically invest a lot in the upfront. And what happens in cases where they fail is that they invested so much in the upfront and they may have a really great product, but they have run out of time to be able to sell that product to pay for those costs. And that's the reality of the situation here, is that businesses don't fail necessarily because they have a bad product. Some businesses do. But most businesses fail because they haven't been able to properly manage their cash. And so there are a ton of great companies out there with great products who have a market that actually want to buy that product. But unfortunately, they just mismanage their costs up front to the point where they run out of time to sell all of that amazing product to be able to pay for those costs. So again, I do see people in beginning years digging themselves a little bit too big of a hole that is too hard for them to crawl out of. And I think for a very, very small flower farmer, that could look like you buy so many seeds that you're never going to be able to plant all of them within a realistic amount of time. So if you only have like a 1/4 acre type of plot or property and you're buying in tens of thousands of seeds, plus bulbs, plus trying to do perennials, you've probably overspent a little bit. And at the end of the day, that's not even the area where you can spend the most on. You can start spending a lot more money on things like infrastructure, on tools and equipment like a tractor. And while a tractor is something I definitely recommend most people at a certain scale invest in or at least consider, it is probably not something I would start out at the get-go buying just because of all of the unknowns and whether or not you want to pursue this going forward. Another part about this concept of cash flow management is making sure that you are thinking about how your revenue is coming in and matching that with the costs that you have to outlay. So for example, there are many vegetable farms that do some sort of CSA for the season, but they choose to launch that CSA sometime in the winter. And that's because when they launch that CSA and people buy it, people are paying upfront for a good that they will receive later on in, we'll call it like January. That infusion of cash gives that vegetable farmer cash at a time of year when they're not going to be selling anything else. Now, here's the problem with that approach is that as you fulfill those vegetable CSAs throughout the year, you are not going to be getting additional cash because you already got that cash in January. So if this is a bigger business, they've got employees and they can't just rely on that CSA revenue in January. They've got to be proactive in making sure they're selling at like a farmer's market or they have some sort of farm stand to continue getting in revenue. So again, this all goes to cash flow management because even if you have a great product and you are able to sell it in the future, if you have costs today that you have to pay off, it does not matter if you have the potential to sell that in the future. Some people might be able to bridge that with something like a credit card, again, because they know or are confident that they're going to get enough money from a farmer's market to be able to pay off that bill. But as you can see, cash flow management can be a complicated equation where you're juggling multiple things in order to see if you can pay off your bills and continue to invest in the business. All right, the last topic in the money bucket is around the concept that time is the most important currency. And I want to talk about two things related to this. So one, I do see a penny wise, pound foolish mentality in very, very new folks who are just getting their feet off the ground, who have been used to gardening, starting from seed. They typically want to minimize their costs. So they have the opposite problem of people in the tech world where they're trying to minimize as much as possible and try to make some money off of it without realizing that in the process of minimizing their costs, they're not considering the time value of their labor. Let's talk about starting from seed versus buying from plug. If you've been following me, you know that I'm a big proponent of trying to buy from plugs and not starting from seed, especially for certain types of flowers that need a really long time in the cell. So things like snapdragons that typically you're starting 90 days before you're getting it into the ground. Or sorry, not 90 days, but typically starting at least like 8 to 12 weeks before you're getting in the ground. Things like Lysianthus, which is going to need about 90 days. So that's 90 days of you babying that plant, making sure it doesn't die, as well as procuring the costs of like the soil, the fertilizer. All of that adds up versus you could outsource that to a third party that does this for a living and is excellent at it and is going to ship you a tray of plugs that are definitely going to be alive by the time you need to plant them in. So I would say that buying from plugs is typically the first step that some of these people need to make in order to shake off this penny wise, pound foolish mentality. Things like investing in very low cost tools like an earthway seeder if you're doing a lot of direct seeding. I can seed a whole row of sunflowers, which involves like 3 rows within a full bed. I can see that by hand probably like within 20, 30 minutes, me walking back and forth and literally doing the seeding and then covering that back up. I can also do it with an earthway seeder for literally like 3 minutes. So the extra time that you save with an earthway seeder, which might cost you $150, is going to rapidly pay back dividends and allow you to spend that time doing something else. And then The third part about this is I see a lot of people not wanting to invest in an expensive course, but then still be willing to experiment and spend quite a bit of money on that experimentation and still failing. So the first example that comes to mind here is winter tulips. Winter tulips are a relatively advanced type of technique. There's not a ton of information on the internet that exists. I think this is a little bit different than I want to start a flower farm, and there's a lot of information on the internet in terms of how to grow from seeds and grow certain types of flowers. I don't want to pay for that information. I can understand that type of mentality, but if you are trying to do something like winter tulips with very little knowledge and are unable to find external free knowledge around it, and you're going to invest in very costly bulbs that might cost you, I don't know, like $500-$600, I would argue that you would have been better off investing that money into something like the tulip workshop, which is around $1,500, so a big chunk of money to invest up front, but you would have made back the cost of that workshop with the amount of bulbs that you had invested in year one, plus a little bit more bulbs, and gotten back all that money and been on your way to making a profit. So in the pursuit of trying to not spend money and waste money, you're also giving up the opportunity cost of potentially making money. And so I'm not saying to go out and buy every single course out there. I'm saying if you think that you are serious about doing a crop in a large quantity or dipping your toes into something that involves education, then just go ahead and prioritize spending your budget on that education, with also prioritizing that you are going to make a profit out of it because you are going to focus on that as a crop. Don't buy a course that you know that you're not going to have time to watch. Don't buy a course that you're like, yeah, I think I just want to dabble in it. The last part of this topic is I see a lot of people not hiring out for very easy things, especially at a point where they feel overwhelmed and that they have a little bit more business than what they can support. So for example, this past winter, I did a winter tulip CSA. It was very popular, so I also offered delivery. I did not want a ton of people coming onto my property for pickup, which is why I offered a delivery option. And that delivery option also allowed me to expand a little bit further than pickup. That delivery, each route would have taken me about an hour 15 to an hour and a half. So what did I do? I hired it out. I paid $25 plus gas plus a free bouquet. And that person was super happy to get all of that to just drive around and deliver flowers. And what that allowed me to do was take that time that I would have spent driving to instead root more bulbs, do more winter tulip stuff, and even do a little bit of marketing. So in this case, I have leveraged time, meaning I've taken something that I had very little of, but created more output from it through something as simple as hiring. And hiring your first employee or just help can be very, very difficult because where do you find this person? How do you give them the instructions? Some people have control or delegation issues. Just try and do it. And every single time you try and do something, it's going to get easier for the next time. In this case, I was able to find someone at Ease Daycare who makes a little bit of side cash babysitting. And I was like, how would you like to make some side cash driving flowers? And she was like, no one's ever approached me with that, but sure. So there are unexpected places where you might be able to find help, and I would start there first. Next, I want to talk about marketing and strategy. And if my channel is something that you've been watching for a while, none of these concepts should be completely new to you. But we're going to cover these just to be comprehensive in this flower farming MBA session. People will forget you exist if you forget to remind them. And that's why we do something called marketing. And these days, marketing can be done in person or behind the screen, which is what most people choose to do. And behind the screen, I mean social media. So marketing is not just being salesy. I think a lot of people are afraid to do marketing because they feel like they're just being very salesy and selling flowers on people. That's not the case. Marketing is simply, one, reminding people that you exist, but two, reminding people why it's important for them to remember that you exist. And typically that's by telling them your story, the why behind your business, and really getting them involved in your business and journey so that they want to purchase from you. That means being consistent on social media, whether or not we like it. That means during this time of year in the winter when there's nothing growing, there's no product, that you are still posting on social media. So you can post things like, here are things that I'm planning on growing in 2025. Here are things that I'm already starting from seed to get ready from 2025. This is what the outside looks like, but down in the soil, there's still a lot of stuff going on. There's so many different ways you can spin the type of content that you can create. You can also take this time to do a little bit more in-person marketing, which I think is completely underrated. Things like going to community events, networking, talking with local council people to make sure that they know that you exist as a small business, looking at small businesses to potentially partner with in the season. Those are all ways of showing up to marketing. So with marketing, talked about how you want to remind your old current customers that you exist. But one thing to remember here is that just because you do some sort of marketing, you should not expect the payoff to be immediate, meaning you should not expect that a customer is going to buy immediately after your offer. And so I want to give you a tangible example here. My husband, Eric, is a realtor, so his job is to help people buy and sell houses. Every single holiday season, he sends a little holiday gift box to his current and old clientele. And there was one person who he helped buy a house who was moving from a different state. They had to put in a ton of offers because it was a crazy market. And ultimately, she was able to find a house. Well, lo and behold, this past holiday season, she contacted my husband and said, hey, I'm relocating for work. I need someone to help me sell my house. Will you do it? And Eric was like, oh, you still remember me? And she was like, yeah, of course I remember you. You keep on sending me these holiday gifts, and you were also really good to work with. So of course I remember you. And that's a great example of, even though he is excellent at what he does, he's not relying on just being excellent at what he does. Because let's face it, there are plenty of excellent realtors out there. He's also focusing on being top of mind for those people so that when it comes time for them to need his services, they're like, oh yes, I remember Eric sent me this little box and he was also really great to work with. So this is a lesson for those of you out there who have a really great product, have a really great relationship, to not forget to still remind them that you will be around to sell them more of that product next year. A really big mistake that I see, especially for newer flower farmers that are in years 2, 3, are that they're not maximizing the value of their top customers. They're forgetting the power of having a really good loyal customer and instead constantly chasing new business. Don't get me wrong, chasing new business is important for any type of business if you want to grow, but equally as important is making sure that your most loyal customers stay loyal to you and are happy. Or if you don't have those loyal customers, that you are working your way to making current customers that loyal customer. Loyal customers is where you could apply something called the Paro Principle, which is that 20% of effort typically can generate up to 80% of your output. So in this case, for year 2, I had done the math. My top 15 customers generated over 75% of my revenue for retail sales that year. I had a ton of customers that I sold a la carte bouquets to. I started selling at the local country store, but yet my top retail sales actually came from around a dozen people, which is nuts. And these dozen people buy from me frequently because they are consistently signing up for multiple CSCs throughout the year. They're buying a la carte bouquets, and they might also be approaching me for special occasions where I can charge a little bit extra because it's a more special bouquet. To turn a customer from just a customer to loyal, it doesn't have to be about discounts. For these loyal customers, I will often give them a discount on the next CSA. But other free things that you can do for them that make them feel valued are offer them an on-farm tour, offer them a behind the scenes, give them a really good type of newsletter where they can see, here are the different types of flowers that are coming in. They're getting a little bit special. They're getting something a little bit more special than just buying a bouquet from your farm stand. Or you can also make sure that you are giving them some sort of like free bouquet at the end of the season if they bought at least like 2 or 3 seasons of CSAs from you in that year. I've done that, and I'll tell you that it's similar to what Eric does in the sense that people would probably be coming back anyway, but they are even more incentivized to come back after I give them some sort of perk, whether or not it's a free bouquet or an intangible perk. The next one is one that I frequently see a lot of people lament on the Facebook groups, which is competition. I'm going to spell it out. Everyone has competition. No matter what business you're in, you have some level of competition. Stop worrying about the competition because chances are you both are not chasing after the same customer. If you're a Mexican restaurant, you probably have like 3 other Mexican restaurants within a decent drive of you. If you're a gym, you probably have like 5 other gyms in a 10 to 15 mile radius if you're in a suburban location. If you live in New York City, there are like 15 coffee shops within a walking distance in some areas. And why can all of these businesses not only survive but thrive? It's because they all have different customers. So I recently got a question from a flower farmer who said, I live in a very competitive state. There's a lot of growers, but I also live next to one of the largest flower markets in the nation. What do you suggest I do? And my piece of advice was, I suggest that you actually shift your mentality from how do I compete with this flower market that's right next to me and steal their customers to how do I find new customers that are not currently going to that flower market or that are not currently buying from other growers? Because I can bet you there are people out there who would still want to buy flowers. They just either haven't discovered that there's actually a local option that makes it convenient for me to buy from them, or they're not happy with the current offerings. So they may not want to go to a flower market. They may not want to drive to a farm stand. They may not have the accessibility of local flowers at the supermarket that they are selling at or at the business that they frequent to. So there's a lot of different ways in terms of finding a different customer, but there's also a lot of different types of customers out there. Maybe the only types of flowers that are being sold at that market are internationally grown, or if they are locally grown, they don't look as good. Maybe that person doesn't have a wholesale license to be able to shop there. Maybe the average retail customer in that neighborhood that you're in wants more specialty types of flowers that you can grow. This is a great time for you to do some market research to figure out who exactly should be that customer that you're selling to. So when you're starting off selling flowers, if you are in an area where there's not a lot of other flower farmers growing, but you have a decent population, I would say you can start off by growing whatever you like and kind of going from there and then doing your market research. But if you know that you are starting off in a place that has a lot of flower farming competition, whether local or even just through big commercial growers, you might want to get a little bit more specific. You might want to do your homework ahead of time to figure out who is going to want to buy flowers. I firmly believe that there is a viable market for practically anyone who wants to sell flowers. The question becomes, who defines that viable market for you, and what are the outlets in which you are going to be able to find that viable person? To round out this category, marketing and sales, I want to emphasize that it is not a transaction, it's actually a relationship. So again, this goes back to this 80-20 rule, especially of nurturing your top customers to become loyal. If you treat every transaction as a transaction, you are not going to be able to build those relationships to build your customers to loyalty. There's something called the marketing funnel that I've referenced many times. I've also done a video up here about that if you want to learn more about it. The goal is for us to get customers into this funnel, so new customers, but have them stay with us as customers. And you want to get them down to that loyalty part of the funnel at the very, very end so that you don't have to do this repeated work to continue finding new customers. A really successful business, especially a small business, is one that is able to take their foot off the gas pedal of marketing when they get into like year 4, year 5, because they've done such a great job of cultivating their current customer base that they don't have to continuously chase after new customers. And this is with the understanding that not all businesses have the objective of wanting to get bigger after every single year. especially with flower farming, there's going to be limits in terms of how much you can produce and how much you want to produce because of how laborious it is, that at a certain point when you can make a livable wage and it's nice, you can focus all of your efforts on the business piece of flower farming versus focusing so much time on marketing. And that all starts with making sure you are building relationships with your customers. I also want to emphasize here that not treating a purchase as a transaction also means you're taking any negative reviews as feedback. And so what you are doing is you are taking the emotions away from a bad review and you are looking at it with some sort of objectivity, and you're asking yourself, does this negative review have merit, and is it feedback for me in terms of a way I can improve? So a personal example here, when I first started my winter tulips, I had delivered a bouquet to a customer that lived about 20-25 minutes away. And that customer responded back to me in a couple of days saying, my tulips died. Is this normal? And I was flabbergasted. I was like, no, it shouldn't have died. Like, tell me a little bit more. I asked her about the temperature of her house. Temperature of her house was like 76 degrees, which is really, really high for tulips. Then she said that she put the tulips next to a window. And although these are all things that the customer did wrong, and I had educated on the back of the business card what to do to maximize the vase life of winter tulips, I said, I will replace that bouquet with a free bouquet and I will deliver it to you next weekend. And she was like, oh, you absolutely don't need to do that. Like, I totally understand that flowers are going to die. I was like, no, I insist. I did that. What happened next? She bought every single CSA that I offered. She came to my house to pick up, especially during this season when I stopped doing a CSA because of my daughter's health issues. She went to the local farm store to buy bouquets. She's told her friends in her neighborhood about my bouquets. She's gifted my bouquets. She has become one of my top customers. This is a prime example of one realizing that, hey, the information I was giving to a customer in terms of extending vase life was probably easily missed. And two, realizing that this was a customer who really wanted to support local businesses and really love flowers. Those are the two things you want to look for in a customer if you're a flower farmer. Someone who loves flowers and someone who wants to support local. So knowing those two and knowing that she was a really reasonable person and wasn't nasty in her negative review, I was like, let me do whatever I can to win you back. So there's a few things that you need to assess here. There are some customers you absolutely want to fire because they're just not people who you want to deal with. But I'll be honest in saying that a lot of people who give you negative reviews are people who you need to actually do a little bit of digging to see, are they actually customers I want to fire, or are they actually reasonable in what they're telling me? And I found that more cases than not, they are reasonable. So this is assuming that you're not just getting one complaint in like a sea of 1,000 successful purchases, because chances are that one person is someone who is just not your right customer. But if you're just starting out, what I'm really trying to say is don't take negative reviews personally. All right, so now we're finally onto the third final bucket, which is actually my favorite. This is around building a long-term sustainable business and what it means to be an entrepreneur. This is my favorite bucket, and I often don't get a chance to talk much about it in my videos because there's really not an appropriate place to talk about many of these concepts. I have always personally been fascinated with businesses as a whole and looking at different industries of businesses and just seeing a high level what makes a business have to operate differently from another because they're selling different products or because they just have different models. So let's get started. The first concept is the best businesses are those that are scalable, and unfortunately, flower farming isn't one of them. I want to start off by saying that this isn't to say that one cannot have a successful flower farm because we see it all the time. There are plenty of successful flower farms that not only make a livable wage, but they make a great wage for not only their families, but also their employees, and they offer a great service to their communities. However, I want to note for the aspiring flower farmer or new flower farmer that this is a very, very hard business. This is a hard business because labor is your primary input. Not only is it laborious, but flower farming has constraints beyond labor. It has constraints with space, and it has constraints with the output that certain types of infrastructure could give you. So top of mind infrastructure that I'm talking about, your vehicle, especially if you're doing something like a farmer's market or you're selling to florists and you have to deliver, your high tunnels or caterpillar tunnels in which you're growing to extend the growing season, and of course the land that you're growing on. Then you've got smaller tools like irrigation, compost. All of that obviously has a limit. So for a high tunnel, you are going to be able to extend your season, but you're only going to be able to produce a certain amount of flowers in that high tunnel before you need another high tunnel. And high tunnels, good high tunnels are not cheap. You're talking about potentially putting in like over $10,000 to get to that next level. Buying a vehicle when you outgrow your little SUV is not a cheap investment, even if you're going for used. So a really good example here is there's a fellow grower at my co-op who is killing it. She's doing absolutely awesome. And she's actually doing it with less labor than I thought she would need to produce her output. She has like a part-time helper, and I think that part-time helper is becoming more of a consistent part-time helper, right? So at a certain point, she's going to need someone who's a little bit more full-time. But the point is that she was able to increase her flower production massively. But what happened? She could not deliver all of her flowers to the cooperative. She needed to get her family members involved. So this past season, where she became even bigger, she realized, I need to invest in a cargo van in order to deliver all these flowers. That cargo van was probably anywhere from like $30,000 to $50,000 depending on its condition. I mean, I don't know how much it cost, but the point is it wasn't just like $1,000. On top of that, she had to build another walk-in cooler. She had to take a shipping container and convert it into a walk-in cooler, which again cost thousands of dollars. So what I'm trying to say is that every business will need to get from one level to the next level. In the world of flower farming, I personally have observed that there are more levels for one to scale in order to get to that next level, and each scaling effort costs money for you to be able to scale, and it's going to take time for you to grow flowers and sell those flowers in order to pay back that scaling. So if you take, for example, something like soap, which is the last side hustle company that I had, my limitation was labor, soap molds, and basically a machine in which you're melting your oils in to be able to pour into the soap molds. Buying a new vat to melt oils in is not as expensive as buying a new high tunnel. Buying new molds is definitely a lot cheaper than buying a high tunnel. Whether or not I made 1,000 bars or 5,000 bars, I was going to be likely to fit that into my SUV. If I was making 10,000 bars, I bet you I could cram that extra 5,000 bars into a pickup truck. I cannot cram an extra 5,000 stems into a pickup truck versus an SUV, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that there are certain products that are easier to scale because the amount of investment needed to scale is a lot less than what you would see in flower farming. This is why you see some of the more successful flower farms not just selling flowers, because in order to get to the next level of revenue, I'm going to have to grow a ton more flowers. So what are some other ways I can bring in revenue? I can do things like on-farm workshops, on-farm tours, U-picks. I could sell things like tubers or bulbs, or I could sell workshop courses to other flower farmers or even local growers or gardeners who are interested in that. They are finding more high-value ticket items that help them scale. It is a lot harder to get that next level by selling $20 bouquets versus selling something like a workshop that might be $50 or $100 for like a bouquet making workshop. As you get bigger, one of the things you need to challenge yourself with saying is, hey, like I'm not just happy with the $20 bouquets that I'm selling because it's a lot of labor to get that $20. How do I take all the inputs that I've already put into this business and create a higher product offering? Meaning something I'm going to be able to sell for a little bit more using what I already have so that I don't have to put in additional infrastructure to make more money. Next concept here is something that I think is intuitive, but it's like exercise. We just don't want to do it. And it is those who put in the reps are rewarded. Repetitions as in reps. So what do I mean by that? I mean, there are a lot of things that we don't know how to do. We don't come out of the womb, or no one comes out of the womb knowing how to do anything. Stuff takes either experimentation or practice to gain some level of skill. I have a friend who is dipping her toes into social media and making content for the company that she's working at. And she's admitted that it's a bit of a struggle. And I had to remind her, you have to make at least 10 videos before you get even some level of comfort as to what you're doing, before you can really make a decision to say, hey, like, is this for me or is it not? And so the world of marketing is one where I see people not really putting the reps, typically because they don't know where to get started. And I'll say, if you don't know where to get started and you've already done your research, just do it. Be okay with failing. Be okay with your first post feeling like you're falling flat on your face. If you haven't started a flower farm and you're questioning, should I start a Facebook page or an Instagram and start talking about flowers? The answer is yes. Just do it. It doesn't matter how bad the content looks like, because when you have those flowers and you're posting constantly about how good those flowers look, very few people are going to go back to the beginning of your feed and be like, I wonder how this person started out and how bad their posts are. No one's going in with that type of intention. And if you're really that sensitive, you can go back and delete those posts later. The point is, get started so that you can have the practice to do it. Next concept ties to this, which is, but at a certain point, after putting in the reps, you need to figure out whether or not you need to change something and whether or not you can be better at it or you can outsource it. So what I'm trying to say here is that there are certain things where we are just going to top out in terms of our knowledge. There are other things where we seem to never top out of it because we just have a curiosity or a desire to want to learn more. But there are many things like accounting or even marketing for some people where at a certain point you're going to be like, that's it, I've reached my limit. And I recognize that I can't go any higher. And so either I'm going to make investment myself to upskill myself, or I'm going to outsource it. And so when it comes to outsourcing, I have a personal belief that unless if it's truly rocket science, you should make an effort to at least understand the fundamentals of what you want to outsource. Because how can I, as someone who has outsourced something, know what good looks like and be able to give direction to that person if I personally don't know what I want or what good looks like, right? Like, it's going to be hard for me to measure the outcome of what someone else is doing if I don't know what a reasonable measurement or outcome looks like. So that can either lead you to set unrealistic expectations for that person you're outsourcing it to, or actually have them underdeliver and you be happy with something that you're paying a lot more than you should be paying. It's also important to note that at a certain point, when you've put in the reps to gain that skill, you have to ask yourself the question, are you making each additional rep count? In other words, are you taking a step back and asking yourself, could I be doing something better? There are plenty of opportunities to do this in flower farming. You could be doing time studies. You could be seeing if there's something you could be doing a little bit more efficiently to make sure you're not spending so much labor time. Something like field tulips. I was not happy with the amount of time I spent on field tulips in year 2. I was significantly not profitable with them because of the amount of time I spent cleaning tulips as well as digging those bulbs out of the ground. So what did I do? I did an experiment. I said, I'm willing to risk the loss of these bulbs because no one else has put out a good resource out there in terms of how to make field tulips less labor intensive. So why don't I do something like no dig, but instead of putting soil on top, let me put leaves on top. So I have a video up here in case of you're interested in that. And that significantly cut back on my labor costs of field tulips to the point where they actually became less labor intensive than hydroponic tulips. Another example here is I was selling at a local retail outlet and I just wasn't happy with the amount of sales I was getting there. I was relying on that country store to drive traffic to buy my flowers. And I realized I could actually take this situation into my own control and drive traffic to that flower stand. So I took a step back and said, I could be doing this better. And I have a video on that if you want to see what I did. So I am constantly reevaluating how things can be done better. And if you are just starting out, it's going to be hard for you to take that time to do that. But if you are going into your third year, this is a great time of year to take that step back and reflect on what are the things that I know for certain, even if I don't have time studies or numbers on a piece of paper, that I know are sucking up a lot of my labor hours and that I can do a little bit differently this year, that I could experiment a little bit differently this year to do better. And that ties perfectly into the next concept, which is that the best and most successful businesses and entrepreneurs are the ones who are willing to embrace change. They're willing to do something that could be different from what other people are doing, or they're willing to shift their business model to keep up with the times. I think the most used example of this is like Polaroid or any type of physical camera that became obsolete due to the digital camera. And while flower farming is not going to progress as rapidly as something like going from a conventional camera to a digital camera, I do think that there are trends that are going to force flower farmers who are in it for the long haul to rethink how they are doing things. One is technology. Flower farming is probably one of the most backwards things in terms of technology that I've ever seen. Like, why are we still calling in orders for seeds and bulbs? Why are we going through a representative to be able to place small orders? I get it if you're placing large orders, but why is this not like an online experience? So there's a huge gap in the bulb industry in terms of making things easier, a one-stop shop for people to order online. Think about using the Ball web platform. It literally took me 2 hours to figure out how to use that thing. Once you figure out how to use it, you realize this is a really complicated system where it is pooling in multiple suppliers or nurseries around the nation to be able to provide you with the most amount of assortment and variety of perennials, annuals, bulbs that you could think of in one spot. The problem is that, again, you have to invest all of that time to learn that. And to my knowledge, that is like one of the few platforms on there or out there in the world that you can actually order online. For most other distributors, you have to call or do stuff on the phone. And it's just one of the things where we live in 2024, almost 2025, we should be able to order stuff online. So think about your flowers, right? Flowers are typically something that people are picking up. People are still going through messaging with you, or people have to go to a farmer's market or a grocery store. Like, why is it not easier for people to buy flowers? I think the local farms, the newer farms that are able to implement technology and make it easier for people to buy flowers are going to be able to attract customers that typically would not be buying flowers but want flowers. They're just too inconvenienced by the fact that they have to go out and buy flowers, and that's just not a concept or something that they're willing to take on. I think that the ever-changing climate is going to force us to rethink about the crops that we are growing. Tried and true crops that might have worked for you 3 years ago may not work for you in 3 more years. I am constantly looking outside to see, we get very humid summers despite our very cold winters. I mean, there's snow outside right now, so it gets pretty cold here. But our summers get really, really humid and hot. And there are quite a few varieties that don't like that humidity. So what are some of the things that I can grow that are typically growing in more tropical environments that I can still get a crop out of to be able to grow here? One good example is something called curcuma, which is something that I trialed this year. If I were flower farming at a larger scale next year, I would be ordering more of these curcuma, I guess tubers they're called, to be able to grow more because they thrived in our humidity and I didn't have to do anything with them. So why would I be babying something or worrying something like zinnias that is going to get powdery mildew in the heat of the summer when I can plant something that's going to thrive in that type of weather? So this type of thinking is what I'm alluding to in terms of challenging yourself to say things are just changing, whether or not we like it or not, and it's not within our control. But what is within our control to make sure that we evolve with those ever-changing times so that we make sure that we are on top of it versus being like Polaroid and being basically put out of business because no one is using film anymore. The next concept here is a little bit difficult to grasp, but I'm going to try to explain it to you with examples to hopefully make you understand it. And that is, do you understand what business you're actually in? So let me give you some examples. If you are a gym owner like an LA Fitness, Planet Fitness, Gold's Gym, like a typical gym model where you buy a lot of equipment and you are relying on people to come in and not come in at the same time, but rely on a lot of people come in to pay for that equipment and make a profit, you are actually not in the business of selling training services or selling a healthier lifestyle. You are in the business of customer acquisition. Your ability to run that business successfully is completely dependent on you getting more people into that door and signing them up. So you are in a sales-oriented business. If you are running a consulting company, an accounting firm, you are actually not in the business of figuring out how to provide good information or accounting services to your end customer. You are actually in the talent acquisition business. And again, this is from the lens of a business owner. Your number one goal is to actually retain the talent that you have hired, because the talent that you have hired has the skill set to be able to provide those services to those clients on their own. So how do you prevent them from leaving? Well, you're going to try to offer them incentives, things like a really good bonus or things like an equity partnership in the business so that they don't leave or that they don't want to leave, because the prospect of leaving and trying to build up a company on their own is going to be a lot more insurmountable than just staying here and reaping the rewards, even though they might have to work for someone else and have longer hours. So when I look at it through the lens of flower farming, we are not in the growing business. Growing is table stakes for you to get a product to be able to sell. If you are selling retail, you are in the relationships business. Again, right? Because you are thinking about that marketing funnel. You're trying to take all the customers who are coming in, who are buying from you for the first time and becoming loyal customers. I think that this is really important, because if you don't know what business you're in, then you may not be focusing on the things that make the most impact in helping your business stay afloat or helping your business grow. The next one here is related to a question that I see often, which is, what's the best website platform that you use to sell flowers? Or what's the best accounting software that you use? The best one is the one that you're actually going to use. So there are so many different types of platforms out there. Nowadays, I would say for website design, at least most of them feel pretty intuitive, but there are some that are still pretty complicated. If you are someone with zero web design experience, go for the one that's going to make your life the easiest. It does not matter if the other one has all the bells and whistles, because if you don't use it, you can't use those bells and whistles. So pick the program that you're actually going to be more likely to use. Another example here is with accounting software. There are some people who try to save money by buying a desktop version, and what that prevents them from doing is accessing their data through the cloud and therefore on their cell phone. And so I find myself doing a lot of accounting through my mobile phone. So I have to pay up for that, right? So a little bit of a penny wise, pound foolish type of analogy here, but pick the type of program or service that's going to allow you to get the most functionality and maximize your usage out of that program. We've got a few left, and I would say these few are geared towards the people who want to pursue a career in flower farming and potentially quit their full-time job. Because what I want to illustrate here is how once you make the decision that you want to sell flowers instead of just growing them for joy, you get a lot of other things that go onto your plate that are not at all growing related, and they may not be things that you like. And I want to make sure that people understand what it takes to build a flower farm that will be able to give you a livable wage or something that you're comfortable with. And so the first one here is more money, more problems. So a lot of people think that once I get to this turning point, or once I get my flower farm into this big magazine or newspaper, there's going to be a magical switch and everything is just going to be okay and I can take a step back and relax. The answer is you're going to have more problems when that happens, because you're going to have more demand coming in. You're going to have more people who want your flowers. So there is no magical turning point at which point you can stop it. The only point you can stop is when you've created a business where you can take a step back and say, okay, like I'm happy with where we're at. We don't need to grow anymore. All the systems and processes in place are good enough, and we can kind of go on cruise control. That's the only time that you can take a step back, but you are still probably working some pretty decent hours to get to even stay at that stage. So I talked a bit before about the different levels of scaling. And when you think about just companies as a whole, there's typically 3 stages of scaling. You've got the very, very beginner stage where you've got like one person, and we're not counting hiring the first couple of employees as the first step of scaling. We're going to count that really small company of around like 15 people. It is very difficult for that 15-person company to scale up and go to, we'll call it like a 60 to 100-person company. The culture completely changes, meaning the relationship that you have with a small group of people, you cannot have that same level of relationship when you become mid-sized. And you find that that jump from 100 people to 1,000 people to be a very different type of jump, because again, that culture completely shifts. Working for a company that has 1,000 to 5,000 people is very different than working with a very close-knit of a dozen people, and even with a smaller company of 100 to 150 people. I have actually worked in companies of all 3 sizes, and I can tell you, not only is the culture different, you're wearing a lot more hats, obviously, in the startup world than you are in a much bigger company. A much bigger company gives you a lot more buffer because there are a lot more systems in places. There's a lot more delegation of tasks all around versus at the other smaller companies. But I'm talking about this because what I want people to understand is that each level requires very different skills and very different types of scaling to get to the next level. Just because you successfully scaled from hiring your first employee and you've been able to hire 12 does not mean that you are going to be able to hire an extra 20 people in the same way that you were able to hire the first and still maintain the type of flower farm that you had. Now, the good news is I don't think most flower farms are going to be hiring more than like a dozen people at most. So what I'm talking about in terms of scaling beyond that is almost a little bit irrelevant, but just hiring that first employee to getting to that 12-person company is going to entail a lot of different processes. And that brings me to the next concept, which is the fact that as businesses, you are looking to increase your enterprise value, which is what the value someone else places on your company and not you. This is the problem with a lot of small businesses, including myself as a flower farmer, is the fact that everything relies on us. I cannot step away. I cannot take a vacation. And when my daughter had her cancer diagnosis, basically the flower farm had to almost come to a halt. And this is because I don't have employees and I don't have systems set in place where even if I didn't have an employee, I could have someone come in and know exactly where to pick up. And this was done by design because I do not want to do this full time. Again, this is for people who want to do this full time. I'm trying to spell out what that entails. So in order to increase your enterprise value, what that means is you have to set in processes and systems so that you can step off the farm and take a vacation. You need to make sure people understand what are standard operating procedures. Things as simple as how often do things get watered? When do I turn on the drip irrigation? When do things like a high tunnel have to be closed? Those are little things that are intuitive to us as flower farmers, but may not be intuitive to other employees. Then you have to think about what are systems in place that I can make sure that I have to retain my employees. What are systems in place for things on the business side, like accounting, marketing, legal stuff? You are building a business so that if you were to sell it, you do not have to be attached to that business when you sell it. Most of us are not looking to sell our flower farms, but if you can successfully sell a business because there are enough systems and processes in place, then that means that you are more likely to be able to take that step back and get to a point where you don't feel like you constantly need to be running around with your head cut off, chasing new business, figuring out how to optimize things because you've already gotten to a point where you've been making a livable wage and you're happy with the lifestyle. All right, the last 2 to close out this is stop looking for a manual. And this is actually probably more relevant for people who are just starting out than for people who are looking to do this full time. Equally as relevant, but the point is that there is no manual, no Bible, no thing on a piece of paper that's going to give you the instructions for what to do.
There might be instructions for how to grow something from seed, but you're going to find that the instructions in the back of the seed packet are not going to be as accurate as you would like them to be, because they're going to be different for everyone depending on where you're growing in terms of climate. Are you starting from seed in a soil block? Are you starting them direct seeded outside, right? Like all of those variables are going to impact the instructions that you are given. So similarly, there is no instruction manual for marketing. There is no instruction manual for running a business. There are a ton of resources out there in which people are willing to share what they've gone through and experienced so that you can hopefully have a shorter time to figuring things out, but there is no manual. And that leads me to my final one, which is do not rely on the free Facebook groups for the most accurate information. We live in a world where there is so much free information, and unfortunately, that free information isn't always accurate. The more experienced I've become in flower farming, the more I've realized that a lot of the information in the Facebook groups is actually inaccurate. And it's not inaccurate because the people who are saying it are saying false things. It's because it's inaccurate for me. For me as a grower in zone 7A in New Jersey, in my specific type of setup, that information is inaccurate for me. So if I'm taking at face value what someone else is saying, growing in Arizona, in the heat, or in Texas, wherever else, that information is actually not going to be very valuable for me. So that is why when I find someone who I really, really like and think that they're a great source of information, I pay for it. So let me give you a personal example that's not related to flower farming. When my daughter was diagnosed with cancer, I wanted to be fluent in being able to speak with doctors so that I could be a true advocate for her. And also, I just have a personal experience with my mother who really to this day, after immigrating to America over 30 years ago, has not taken on this language of English at a fluent level. And so while she can get around the grocery store and do little things like that, she and I don't speak in English, we speak in Chinese or Mandarin. And the implication of that is that she and I will never be able to have a true immersive conversation around non-mundane topics. And so like even things like describing what I do in my job or like what is going on in current events, I would not be able to converse with her because my Mandarin is not good enough on that level. My Mandarin is only conversationally fluent. So I say this because I understood that. And when it comes to medicine, I wanted to make sure that I didn't have that type of limitation. So I started doing research and trying to figure out how do I become more medically conversational and fluent in this language. And I found a guy named Peter Tia, runs a really great podcast, and just by exposure and putting in those reps of listening to his podcast, I started getting fluent in that conversation. But then I found out, he has a subscription where I can get access to show notes, premium articles, all this other stuff. That's going to accelerate my learning. I already trusted him as a good provider of balanced knowledge in this area, so I decided to pay for his subscription, which is $150 a month. And this subscription is amazing. I mean, it's given me inspiration for my Patreon because his premise is he wants to provide value beyond the $150 a year. And that is now what I am trying to model my Patreon off of, which is $60 a year. I hope you're getting way more value than what it is worth because the amount of value I got from his transcripts, his show notes, and his subscription has been hugely instrumental in terms of making sure that I feel equipped enough to be able to talk to doctors about my daughter's health. And we've now gotten to the point where about 3 months in, literally every single doctor who I talk to has questioned me, do you have a medical background? And I don't say this to toot my horn. I say this because I think that if you are focused and you find the right resources, you can gain a significant amount of knowledge, a baseline amount of knowledge that will allow you to basically do things in a much more productive way than if you didn't invest in that time. And we live in a world now where you have the information to be able to do that. It's a matter of finding the right information. And if you want to accelerate that, paying for all that information aggregated in one area. That is why people pay for most workshops. I would say that most workshops are not giving you completely new groundbreaking information. They are just aggregating it for you in a one-stop resource so that you don't have to spend all of this time finding other stuff. All right, so this was really, really long. I've been wanting to do a video like this for a while. I really hope that it not only helps those of you who have been in this journey with me for the last couple of years, but that it gives people a realistic understanding of what flower farmers deal with when they decide that they want to sell flowers for money. Gardening is very different from farming. You can see from farming, there's the business aspect of it, there's the scaling aspect of it, but gardening is really a true joy and true passion. The moment you decide you want money for that passion and joy, you are turning that passion and joy into something that's not going to be as joyful because it's going to be a business and it's going to be a little bit different than what you had experienced before. So let me know if you have any questions in the comments. And in the meantime, here is a quick update on E.
Is that a ball?